And here goes the final coding challenge of this section. And in this one, let's improve the tip calculator that we created earlier, but this time using loops. So here is what I want you to do. First, create an array called builds, which will contain the 10 test values that we have down here. Then create empty arrays for both the tips and the totals. And so these arrays should be called tips and totals. And if you need more details about this challenge, you can always go back to the code of the previous version that we wrote of this. Then in number 3, use the calc tip function that we wrote before. And so go back to that challenge really and copy the function from there. There's no need to repeat the same code. So use that function to calculate both the tips and the total values for every single bill value that is in the builds array we created in number 1. And to do that, of course, use a for loop, just as we learned over these few last lectures. And my hint to help you a little bit with this in case you need it is to call the calc tip function inside the loop and then use the push method to keep adding values to the tips and the totals arrays. All right, so that's the basic challenge, and hopefully you can solve it even if you need to consult the code that we wrote earlier. That's absolutely no problem. So there's no need to memorize anything. All you need is to understand. And so if you understood what we did up until this point, you should be able to look at the code that we wrote and then change that in order to fit this challenge. Now, if you want to challenge yourself even more and basically push what we learned to the limit, then I have a bonus question. And here I want you to write a function calc average, which will take any array called R as an argument. And this function will calculate the average of all the numbers in the array that it received. Now let me tell you that this is a very difficult challenge for you at this point, because we haven't done anything like this before. Okay? So if you don't want to get frustrated or something, then there's no need to try this one. You can just watch the solution at the end of this video. But if you still want to attempt how to do it, here are the steps how to solve it to make it a bit easier. So first of all, you will need to add up all the values in the array that the function receives. And to do that, you start by creating a variable called sum and set it to 0. And then you will loop over the array using a for loop. And in each iteration, you will add the current value of the array to the sum variable. And by doing this, you will end up with all the values in the array added together. And then to calculate and return the average, all you have to do is to divide the sum that you just calculated by the length of the array, because that is the number of elements. So for example, if the array had just 2 values, like 10 and 20, we would add them together, they would be 30, and then divided by the number of elements in the array. And so that would be 2, and so the result would be 15. Okay, that's how you create the calc average function, and then I want you to use that function on the totals array. All right, so basically I want you to calculate the average of all the total values of the tips plus bills. Okay. So again, don't beat yourself up if this bonus one is too hard for you. Anyway, good luck with this one, and I see you here again in a minute. Okay, and let's start by grabbing the calc tip function from earlier. So that should be here. Okay. And that's why we keep all the code in one neat file like this. Next up, we create the builds array. And this one has quite a number of values, but we can just copy them. They're already almost in the correct format. So no and, but a comma. Then we create the empty tips and totals, const tips, equals an empty array, and const totals another empty array. And now is where the magic starts. So basically where we will calculate the tips and the totals. So that is question number 3. So use calctip to calculate tips and total values. So essentially what we will do is to loop over the builds array and then fill up these two arrays. So for let I equal 0, and we want this to run while the counter is less than the length of the builds, which is 10, and so the last index is 9, and so that's the last element that's going to be taken. And now in here, let's start by calculating the tip and store it in a variable. So const tip is equal, and now we're using the calctip function. So we call it using parentheses, and now we need to pass in the bill value. And what is the bill value? Well, it is just the builds array at the current position. And now you might wonder why I am able to declare this tip variable here as a constant. Am I not changing it in every loop iteration? Well, actually that's not what happens. Actually, in each iteration, a new tip variable is going to be created. So we're not mutating, we're not changing the original tip that we declare here. In each iteration, we will simply create a new one. And that's why we can use const. Anyway, now we have the tip calculated, and so we just need to push it into the tips array. So tips.push, and here the tip. And finally, we need to push into the totals. So totals.push the tip plus the current bill. And we already know that that is builds I. Okay, and that's actually it. Now you could have done it in a different way. For example, without this variable here at all, you could have just put this code here and here. But then you would have calculated the value twice, and that's just not necessary. We just calculate it once, and then we use it both to push the value into the tips and into the totals. Okay, and now as always, let's check all the 3 arrays out in the console. And whoa, that's a lot of numbers. But just by quickly looking at them, everything looks correct. Great, that's really great. We basically just did the same as we did in the previous version of the challenge, but this time we did it using a loop instead of manually creating the array by calling calctip with builds 0, 1, and 2. So that's what we did in the previous challenge, but this one is a lot better. Because now, no matter how many builds we have here, the loop will take care of all of them at the same time, basically. Okay, so that's the basic challenge. I hope you arrived at the same result that I did, no matter how you solved it. And now let's go for the bonus here. So we're writing a function called calcAverage. So const calcAverage. And once again, I'm using a function expression here, which is my favorite kind of function, I would say. And as we said, we will receive an array, and any array here will work. So once again, we're building a generic function which does not care what kind of values it's going to receive. It can receive builds or tips or scores or heights or masses or whatever, really. It doesn't care what the values are. And that's also why I gave it this generic name. So it's just calcAverage and not, for example, calcAverage totals. Let's now do what we say, or what I say here in 4.1, which is to start creating a sum variable that starts at 0. Then as we loop over the array, we will keep adding the current value to that variable. So this time it needs to be a let, because this sum will of course be updated as we loop over the array. And now all of this is pretty standard at this point. So equal 0, I should stay below the array dot length. And so this time array is simply the array that we're receiving in this function. So it's this parameter. And now, as I said, as we loop over the array, we will keep adding the current value to the sum. So what I mean is sum will be equal the current value of sum plus the array that we received as an input at the current position. And that's it. We're just missing here the increment of the counter, but that's easy to fix. And this one here could be even more condensed. So let me just copy this one and comment out the original one, because remember that we have a more shorthand operator in JavaScript, which we can use when we want to update a value. So instead of sum equals sum plus, remember we can write sum plus equal array I. So this one is exactly the same as this. So if you prefer, you can write just this version, but this here is going to do exactly the same thing. Okay, and just to see if this works, let's actually test this now by logging only the sum. So console.log sum, and now again to test it, I will just call the function calcAverage with simply an array of some values. So 2 plus 3 plus 6. And we know that this will be 11, right? And so now we can test this function here just to see if this first part that we just wrote works. Let's see. And yes, we get 11. And so this logic here is correct. So we got this array here into the function. Okay, and so R is now 2, 3, 6. And so that's the array that we're then looping over. Okay, so we end up with a sum. And now what we want to return is simply the sum divided by the number of elements in the array, which remember is r.length. And that's it. We can now get rid of this, but now we need to log the result to the console if we want to see it, because this function here now does not log it, it simply returns it. And remember that that is a big difference. So we know that the sum of this is 11, and 11 divided by 3 is something like close to 4. So we could change this here to 7, then the sum would be 12, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. And so then we can make sure that this function works. So it is 4, so great. This means that the function now works. And so now we can use this function to actually calculate the average total. And so here we simply use the totals value that we already created before. And that's it. So the average total value of all our builds plus tips is 275 and 19. And let's actually do the same with the tips themselves, just to get an idea of the kind of tips that were paid here. So the average tip is 42.89. Hopefully that part here was not too confusing. But if you go slowly through the code step by step, you will understand it. All right, and with this, we finished the complete JavaScript fundamentals. So we made a ton of progress here. So congratulations for making it this far. Great job, really. However, as you know, we are really just getting started here. There is so much more to learn. And actually in the next section, we will quickly configure our VS Code editor a little bit better and also set up a better development environment. So that's going to be super useful for writing code a little bit faster. And I will also teach you some developer skills that every developer should really have. But as always, before moving on, make 100% sure that you understood all these fundamentals from this section and the previous section. So if you want, you can redo the challenges, or you can come up with your own small problems or ideas to solve. And by doing that, you will reinforce all these tools even better and ultimately become a better developer faster. Then, when you're really ready, let's together move forward.